What does it mean to view science as a social enterprise? For many, science is a straightforward, almost linear process of knowledge generation. In the conventional picture of science, the kind of image that we are all introduced to in school, scientists driven by curiosity formulate a hypothesis. They then design a rigorous experiment, gather data, and arrive at an objective conclusion. This discovery is then published, and its knowledge is applied by engineers, policymakers, and industry to create new technologies and solve societal problems. This is what we call the linear model of science, a clean, unidirectional path from discovery to application. Now, science and technology studies challenges this neat, tidy picture. Instead of viewing science as a separate realm that exists out there, STS scholars argue that science is a profoundly human and social activity shaped by the very cultural, institutional, and social contexts in which it is practiced. It is, in every single sense, a social enterprise, built by people working together, competing, and negotiating within a complex web of institutions, norms, and values. Now, this is not an attack on the integrity of science and all its contributions. Science has effectively saved the lives of millions, if not billions, of humans over the last few centuries. It is, however, a more realistic and nuanced understanding of how science actually operates. Our aim in this class is not to debunk science, but to analyze it as a phenomenon worthy of study in its own right, much in the same way a sociologist might study a political movement or an anthropologist might study a cultural ritual. Now, the first and most central concept that we will tackle today is the idea of the social construction of scientific knowledge. Now, this term often raises eyebrows. When we say scientific knowledge is socially constructed, we are not suggesting that scientists simply make things up or that facts are a matter of opinion. No. That is not the correct way of understanding socially constructed. Rather, we mean that the process of generating scientific facts is deeply influenced by social factors and takes place in the context of self-correcting societal and social institutions. These factors include who gets funding, which research questions are deemed important and worthy of study, the organizational structures of labs and universities, the career ambitions of individual scientists, and the prevailing cultural values and political priorities of the time. From this perspective, while science is connected to a tangible, empirical reality, it is not the best or the only way of accessing and making sense of that reality. Indeed, science can understand the same slice of the world through very different, non-competing conceptual frameworks that articulate the way scientists study and write about the world. We call these frameworks paradigms. The concept of a paradigm, first articulated by the historian of science Thomas Kuhn in his groundbreaking work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, is central to this notion of science. Kuhn argued that science doesn't progress in a purely linear fashion in the way we are taught at school, with a scientist succeeding or surpassing what a previous scientist did in this succession of events that leads us closer to truth with a capital T. Rather, it operates within a dominant conceptual framework or paradigm that defines what problems are considered important, what counts as valid evidence, and what methods are acceptable for the scientific community. During periods of normal science, as Kuhn would call them, researchers work happily within the established paradigm, filling in the details of the picture that it provides. However, now and then, anomalies that cannot be explained and that emerge in scientific research and that are not made sense of by the current framework start to accumulate. And a paradigm shift or scientific revolution can occur, leading to a new conceptual framework that redefines the field in its entirety. Building on Kuhn's work, sociologists like Barry Barnes and the Edinburgh School of STS further emphasize that social and institutional aspects of paradigms are critical for understanding how they operate. For them, a paradigm isn't just a set of ideas. It is much more profoundly a social institution maintained and defended by a community of scientists who share a common set of beliefs and practices. This idea highlights how the knowledge we accept as scientific is deeply intertwined with the social and political dynamics of the community that produces it. Consider, for example, the history of primatology as seen through the lens of Donna Haraway's classical and very famous work. Early studies often emphasized aggression and hierarchy, a perspective that aligned both with a Cold War era political anxiety about the world and a patriarchal view of society. Chimpanzees and other primates were reflections or used as reflections of these geopolitics and the politics of gender at large. Now, researchers sought out data and confirmed their hypotheses about primates. The scientific community largely accepted these findings through this lens of a particular understanding of the world. However, later, as feminist movements gained traction and cultural values started to shift in the West in particular, a new generation of primatologists, notably Jane Goodall, conducted long-term immersive studies that revealed complex social relationships, cooperation, and maternal bonds among the primates. The facts about primate behavior changed, not because the animals changed, but because the social and political lens through which scientists were observing them had shifted. This is a classical example of social construction in action. The knowledge produced was inseparable from the social context in which it was produced. Now, to get an even closer look at this process, STS scholars began a practice known as laboratory studies. In the 1970s and 1980s, researchers like Bruno Latour and Steve Wohlger literally embedded themselves in working scientific labs, acting like ethnographers studying a foreign society. Their seminal group, Laboratory: The Social Construction of Scientific Facts, revealed that the linear model of science was indeed a myth. They found that facts were not simply discovered, but were built through a complex and messy process of negotiation, instrumentation, and persuasion. A scientist's claim was not immediately accepted as a fact. It had to be a successful claim, meaning it had to be supported by colleagues, replicable by other labs, and demonstrably better than competing explanations. In this view, a scientific fact is not a singular event, but a carefully constructed outcome of a social process, solidifying over time as more scientists and institutions rally around it. Now, this study or this body of work leads to the concept of an actor network theory, an influential framework developed by Bruno Latour and others like Michel Collin in the 1980s and 1990s. An actor network theory proposes that the world is made up of networks of both human and non-human actors. In a scientific context, these actors include the scientists, the research assistants, the funding agencies, the journal editors, the computer software, the lab equipment, the raw data, and even the natural phenomenon being studied. They are all part of a network. They are all actors connected in specific ways through the act of producing knowledge. The success of a scientific project, the creation of a new drug, for example, depends on the successful enlistment of all these diverse actors, sort of in the same way that the production of a play requires everyone performing a particular role from the props all the way to the actors. If a crucial piece of equipment breaks or a funding agency pulls its support, or a colleague simply refuses to endorse a finding, the network destabilizes and the project may fail. AMT helps us understand that a scientific discovery is not a triumph of a lone genius, but rather a collective achievement, a social endeavor that requires a vast and interconnected network of support. Now, this concept will be useful later in the course as we discuss the fragmentation of elites and how the current political situation and the political situation over the last 20 years has led to the breakdown in crucial networks that once supported science to the modern situation where science is under quite, but that is for a later part of the course. Finally, we have a concept within science and technology studies that also reveals some of the social dynamics of science, and that is the concept of boundary work. This refers to the rhetorical strategies used by scientists and other actors to create a clear and distinct boundary between what is considered science and what is non-science. This is a powerful tool for maintaining authority and securing resources. When a scientist argues that a certain topic is political and not scientific, they are engaging in boundary work. When they defend the pure objectivity of their research against the accusations of bias, they are drawing a boundary. This practice is central to the politics of expertise. For decades, scientific elites have successfully used boundary work to position themselves as the sole legitimate arbiters of truth, distinct from the messy world of politics and society and economics. The current crisis, as we'll argue, is in part a crisis of this boundary work, of the capacity to engage in this boundary work and to draw boundaries at all, in part because of changes in how expertise and authority are now drawn in a world where social media dominates the public sphere. The boundaries are blurring, and the traditional claim to authority that once was held by scientists and other groups is now being challenged. So how do all these concepts come together to the core argument of our course? The traditional social contract of science, which flourished in the post-Second World War era, was built on a stable and robust network of elites. Political leaders provided funding and policy support. Business leaders provided industrial application, technological infrastructure, and financing to science and scientific institutions. This network allowed scientific elites to conduct their work, and their authority was largely undisputed. The fragmentation of this network, fueled by the rise of things like neoliberalism, the splintering of political parties, and the emergence of new media platforms, has destabilized this delicate balance. The breakdown of this established actor network has left science more vulnerable, more exposed to political and economic pressures. The challenge to scientific authority from new kinds of influencers and social media platforms can be seen as a direct assault on the traditional boundary work that once protected scientific expertise. This critique of the linear model has deep historical roots, and we will try to think about how these connect to the moments we are living today. A key voice in this discussion, for example, was historian David Noble, whose seminal work, America by Design, challenged the very notion of science as a purely endless frontier driven by curiosity. Noble argued that modern American science and technology were not neutral or independent forces, but were fundamentally shaped by the social interests of their patrons, corporate and military elites. Through a detailed historical account, he demonstrated how the Industrial Revolution and the needs of a growing capitalist economy and military establishment actively directed scientific research, from the development of machine tools to the establishment of the modern university as a training ground for engineers and technicians. Noble's work helps us see that the connection between science and elite interest is not a new phenomenon, but rather a long-standing historical relationship that has continuously evolved. And it is the change in this relationship what matters in explaining the vicissitudes of science today. So in conclusion, science and technology studies offers us a toolkit, an impressive and powerful toolkit to go beyond a simplistic, idealized view of science. It invites us to examine the messy, complex, and deeply human processes that create scientific knowledge. By understanding science as a social enterprise, we can begin to see that its current struggles are not a result of a decline in its quality or its integrity. This is incredibly important. Science is under attack not because it's worse or because it is producing worse kinds of knowledge, but it's because of a consequence of profound shifts in the social and political networks that have historically sustained it. Science still saves lives. Science still solves problems. The problem is not with science, but with those that are around it. This is the foundation upon which we will build our entire course. In the next session, we will put some of these STS lenses to work by examining the historical context of the post-war social contract for science and the era of technocratic consensus that it helped to create. Thank you very much.